Welcome back to my studio. Today I wanted to talk about speaker phase. And there are two kinds of phase issues that can come up with loudspeakers. The first is what most people mean when they talk about speaker phase. And they're talking whether a pair of speakers is in phase or out of phase. So what causes out of phase speakers is if you have, let's say, the right speaker, the plus and minus are correctly connected to the amplifier, and the left speaker, the plus and minus are backwards. The wiring is backwards, so you have plus to minus, the amplifier's plus to the speaker's minus, and the amplifier's minus to the speaker's plus. So the effect of that is, as you play, let's say, a mono recording, one woofer would move forward while the other moves back, and vice versa. And that causes a number of very obvious sonic effects that are not desirable. You'll lose bass, and the whole sound will have this sort of diffused, phasey sound. And I recommend you try it on purpose just to see what that sounds like. So you'll be able to recognize that when you hear it again. But the subject of today's video is a more subtle concept, which is more of an audiophile concept of absolute phase. And what that means is, it turns out that recordings are almost arbitrarily either have correct absolute phase or inverted absolute phase. And what that means is, at any instant in time, as the music's playing and you're listening to it on your stereo, the drivers should be, let's say, when there are times in the music when the drivers should be moving towards you, and there are times in the music when the drivers should be moving away from you. And if that is reversed, things will not sound as good as they could. So, as I said, recordings, it turns out, they're almost half and half each way. It's somewhat arbitrary. It's as though the recording engineers or someone along the process of making a record or making a digital recording and putting it on YouTube flipped it by mistake. Anyway, there are also a small number of recordings that were made with many microphones, like some of the studio recordings, where it's possible to have some instruments with correct absolute phase and other instruments in the same recording that have inverted absolute phase. Those are pretty rare, but they do happen, so be on the lookout for those. Now, the good news is that it's really easy to correct absolute phase. If you're listening to a recording that has inverted absolute phase, all you need to do is turn off your power amp, and if the speaker wires are connected red to red and black to black on each speaker, just flip them around, turn your amp back on, and now you've inverted the polarity of your playback system. Another way to do this is, if you're lucky to have a DAC or a balanced preamp or a balanced integrated amp that has a specific phase inversion switch, you just press the switch and it'll invert the phase. Obviously, if you have a switch like that on your DAC and a switch like that on your preamp, you don't want to invert them on both, because then you're inverting it and then inverting the inverting, which is just making it, bringing it back to absolute phase again, normal absolute phase, or non-inverted absolute phase. Okay. As far as I know, the only way to tell if something has correct absolute phase or inverted absolute phase is by listening. And it's a little like diet sodas, I'll give as an example, where if you're used to the flavor of a regular soft drink and then you try a diet soft drink, it'll still sort of taste like that soft drink, but you'll taste something's a little funny. Something doesn't taste right, something doesn't seem natural. And that's the kind of thing you can hear with recordings as well. So typically, if something has proper absolute phase, a recording, it'll sound fuller and warmer, versus if it's out of phase, if inverted absolute phase I should say, it'll sound a little hollow, a little thin. When you have correct absolute phase, the bass will be punchier and more solid sounding. The instruments will have a more natural tone. Voices, saxophones, horns, guitar playing, everything will have a more natural tonal balance. You'll hear a little more detail sometimes, a little more air. Out of phase things can sound a little hard versus warm and I'm not sure what the word is, but warm and like just more comfortable to listen to. And voices in particular, when they're out of phase, can sound distant, versus when the absolute phase is correct, they'll be a little more present. And the imaging, when they're out of phase, images tend to recede in a very kind of homogeneous manner, whereas with correct absolute phase, there's more variety in front to back imaging. So those are some of the things you can listen for. And what I've done is, in the description below, I've listed a few songs. I've listened to them myself and made my best characterization of the sound as to whether the recording is in phase, rather correct absolute phase, or inverted absolute phase. So you can listen to the same, play the same YouTube tracks and hear it for yourself and try changing the phase and see what happens. But I thought it'd be helpful. It's sort of like having the answers to a test and trying the problems yourself. And the last thing I wanted to say is I'm really grateful for all the people that have started to watch and subscribe to my videos. It's not my full-time job. So I read all your comments, but from here forward I can't guarantee that I'll respond to all the comments. And thanks again for watching. Take care. Bye.